Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to the Accursed. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and it's one you may have heard before, but let me put a fresh spin on it. A fresh coat of paint. And we'll see what you think of it once we're done. There once was a woman. She lived in a homestead far from any village or road. Within her home, nice and warm, thick walls, plenty of provisions, were 6 children, all hers. There was no man of the house. She was the hunter, the gatherer, the protector, their warden. And she was, by all accounts, a loving mother. A fine woman indeed, capable of raising these 6 healthy children. This was the Iron Age, I should point out, when the story is set, and so that's no small thing to raise 6 children and have them all be healthy. But there was also a landowner, a vicious man, prone to capricious torments. He would visit these torments upon the woman whenever he so chose, and he would do so, and she would withstand it, because she knew that she could withstand it, that to withstand these torments allowed her 6 children to remain safe. It was part of the deal, that to remain on these lands, this landowner's lands, she would give herself up to whatever it was he demanded. Well, that is the way the life went, at least for a time, and then, of course, winter came, a devastating winter, one like none other. It swept in from the mountains and froze the ground, killed animals by the score. Even the trees began to die. There were no crops that could be grown within months. This winter was not ending, and her children, and her, this woman, they were starving. But they received a visitor. In their desperation, it was the man, this landowner. And he wasn't starving, though he was most certainly hungry. He was wearing thick furs, and he had a round stomach. He even exuded warmth. And he made her an offer. He said, "I can see that you are suffering, and so I am here to make you a deal. I will protect all you and 3 of your children if you give 3 of your children over to me." Now, she knew this man for what he was. She knew that he was the kind of heart-eater that would not allow them anything other than a devastating life, and a truncated one at that. She had no desire to hand over 3 of her infants to this man, who gave her until the dawn to make up her mind. But she had to weigh up in her mind, is it worth 3 deaths to save 3 more? No, she couldn't do it. She knew she couldn't do it. There was nothing in her makeup that would allow her to sacrifice her children. Could she not give herself? No, this wasn't what the man was interested in. He wanted 3 of the infants. And so she prayed. She prayed like never before. She prayed to the wind, to the snow, to the sky, to the frozen earth itself, and nothing answered. She screamed her prayers, and it was only when she was screaming at her highest pitch that a scream was returned. The wolves, also suffering in the wilderness, howled in response, and so her scream became a howl, and their howls became screams, and they competed in unison until eventually even the sky itself revolted against their anguish, and thunder pealed and lightning struck, blasting the land, destroying trees. She had her answer. The storm had answered her. And so when the man returned come the dawn, she had made her mind up as to how to act. He was there with his coterie of friends, all of them alike, and he demanded her response, sure that she was going to give up children to save 3 more. She leapt on him, and with a ferocity unmatched, she tore the heart from his chest. And as his companions began to flee, her children broke loose from the house. And while his companions were fat and laden down with furs and struggling to trudge through the snow, they were lithe and half-starved, and they had knives in their hands like claws on a wolf's paws. And so they leapt on the men, and they hacked them to pieces, and the wolves, smelling blood, entered the area and started ripping them apart as well. As she devoured this man's heart, and the consciousness flickered from his eyes, his undeath coming to a conclusion, she was damned. She became the first of the Get of Lyka. She was, I suppose, Lyka, and her children were her Get. That is a pretty tale, isn't it? It's one that the Get of Lyka love to tell, especially if this is your first day as one of them. Yes, it's one thing to become one of the Primal, but when you realise that you're a member of the Get of Lyka, one of your family members will tell you that story. It's all about protecting family. It's all about sacrificing anything you can, never letting anyone crush you under their heel. That's what it's about, except there's another version of the story. Of course, this is the version that the heirs tell, a hungry family, purportedly the family from which the man, the heartless man, by the end of the story, came from. And allow me to regale you a little. Supposedly, he was their protector. Supposedly, this man, through charity, had allowed this woman, her children, land, food, furs, bones with which to make tools. And when the winter came, he was hit as hard as anyone else, but he had an entire community to look after. So he opened up his manor, and he invited in the people who lived closest first, and he ensconced them in rooms throughout the manor. People were cramped, shoulder to shoulder, and he was aware disease could spread. There had to be a limit. But then he remembered at the witching hour, just as the cold was getting to its worst point, the homestead on the borders of my land. I need to go out to that woman. I need to see if she wishes to give me any of her children. I only have space for 3 children. So he ventured out, embracing the fur close to him, withstanding the cold winter wind. He knocked on her door and he let her know, I can only look after 3 children. Please deliver them up to me so that I can care for them. And she said, I must think on this. I must choose which 3. And so he said, do not take too long. It will only get colder. He returned at dawn with some of his friends, as we know, and she gave him his answer. She agreed. I will give you 3 of my children. But in the process of doing so, she betrayed him. She betrayed the vow that she would give over 3 of her children and sacrifice her own life to the winter. She betrayed the man who had cared for her all these years, who maybe even loved her. And she ripped out his heart, probably figuratively, but maybe literally. And when she consumed it, she was consuming all his trust. And she had set her children to become feral beasts, killing all the man's friends. And then they were not done, because so possessed with this ferocity were they that they advanced on the man's manor and they slew everyone within it, rolling through it like a tide of thunder, a great tempest, scouring the land of everyone but her family. And then they moved on to the plains, the swamps, the hills, and they killed, and they killed, and they killed, because ever since her betrayal, she was damned. The Get of Lyka were born. Now, you can probably imagine why one tale is favoured over the other as far as the Get of Lyka are concerned. And I know many more. There is Lykaon, the king of Arcadia, who was smart. He was a trickster. He felt that Zeus needed bringing down a peg or 2, and not believing that Zeus was all-knowing, said, I will lay on a feast for you, Zeus, of mystery meats, and I wager you will not be able to identify the source of every one of them. Well, Zeus was wise. He was all-knowing, and so when he bit down into the guts of one particular creature, he realized that he was eating human flesh. And Lycaon laughed and said, yes, you are eating my son, Nyctimus, the knight. Zeus was outraged that he had been tricked into eating a human, and so he cursed Lycaon into becoming a werewolf, the first werewolf. Now, isn't that just neat, that little myth? Because, well, whether it was Nyctimus, Lycaon's grandson Arcus, whether it was the body of a prisoner, the idea that these animals these shapeshifters stemmed from some kind of betrayal, especially the betrayal of an individual by the name of Lykan. It all sounds rather appropriate, doesn't it? And yet it could also be something like the Lyka festival on the slopes of Mount Lycaon, where the Arcadians would commit great acts of sacrifice that ended in cannibalism, and the most honoured warrior would become a hybrid of man and beast. A werewolf. As I say, lots of stories, some more or less popular than others. You can probably imagine why the Lykans aren't all that keen on all this cannibalism talk, or indeed all this betrayal talk. Yes, they favour one story over the other, but you always have to measure up what sounds true and what sounds like propaganda. So I understand why the Get of Lyka don't want their entire legacy tied to all of that, and as an accursed family, they are more than that. My abiding feeling of the Lykans is that they are the kind of accursed who you want at your side, or preferably in front of you when shit goes bad. And believe me, the vast majority of Lykans are brave enough that that will be the case. Boldness is a hallmark of this family of Accursed. They do not like to sit in the back row. They are commanders. They are natural battlefield commanders, but not the kind of commander that will sit back at HQ. They will not stand for that. No. They must be on the battlefield, and they expect no one to get their hands dirty unless the Lycan too is prepared to sink their claws into the chest cavity of the battle-forged, or whatever the enemy might be, in front of them. So they have standards. And they have a certain, well, they are owed respect. On the subject of respect, I know that they have a needling chip on their shoulder. They would much rather be seen as more than just brutes on the battlefield, even though their howls are sufficient to command others to follow in their footsteps whenever they advance. You see, it's a primal politics thing. There's no leader, per se, of the Primal, but there is a keeper of secrets, especially as pertains to the Damnations that exist. For the longest time, that's been the Raptors. They are seen as one of the eldest families, one of the wisest, solid, stolid. And the Hides have been pecking at their heels. For a while it was the Sphinx. Presently it's the Hides. The Hides believe it is a time for renewal, for change, for remaking the natural order of things. In all of these conversations and these feuds, and there's no open war about this, and again, it isn't leadership so much as the people who have the right to declare certain movements for the Primal, the Get of Lyka are never considered. They resent that. They resent that in a rather significant way, and who can blame them? They are the shapeshifters who are most often out in the battlegrounds. They are the ones who are tracking down beasts that have escaped from the outside. They are the ones sacrificing their lives to save their fellow accursed. Because it comes back to that fundamental part of the Get of Lyka, protectiveness. They protect their family, but they also protect any of their loved ones, their bondmates around them. The Lykans are a storm of claws and teeth. Once they have their mind set on prey, they will not be deterred. But remember that more than just teeth and claws, they are a storm. If the Lykans have a motto, it's this: a good storm is needed to wash the curses of old away. Well, believe me when I tell you that when the Get of Lyka strike a person or a place, when they blast it, well, any blight from the outside, any lingering old curses have been so thoroughly eradicated as to be, well, a distant memory. They are certainly storms. And on the subject of that, I am reminded of a Lycan I once met. I've in fact met him several times, but it goes by the name of Lennon. Has round glasses, like John Lennon. I don't know if that's where he gets his name from. Lennon is an interesting individual. Part of a crew that he leads into exploring the outside. There is no tracker, trapper, hunter, more efficient, more effective than Lennon, who knows, I would suggest, 90% of the liminal spaces throughout Junction City, whether they're underground, in alleys, in those corner shops that only some people can see, whether they're on the outskirts, the city limits. Lennon has spent time and effort and blood in not only finding them, but mapping them and exploring them and taking on some of the most vile threats within them. Because it isn't just protectiveness that drives the Get of Lyka, it's its territory. And in Lennon's mind, every one of these outsides that he has explored from end to end, every liminal space that he has conquered or mastered, he feels is, well, as much his as it belongs to any Archon or Fae. He knows how they work. And this is what makes him dangerous. Lennon is an interesting example. I mentioned Storms, of a Lykan who eschews the wolf aspect. What do I mean by that? Well, when a Lykan takes on their wild form, they are not transforming into a wolf. The wild form is something far more than that. The wild form is a primal form, a chimerical form, something somewhere between human, beast, and monster. And so the average Lycan, if such a thing could be said to exist, looks something like a huge bipedal wolf with magnificent fangs, titanium claws, and something you really don't want to get in the way of. But there'll be aspects of human in there. There'll be aspects of jackal and coyote and fox as well as wolf, and other more absurd and mythological creatures. Not in the case of Lennon. Lennon leans more toward the elemental side of the primal, because you understand, primal does not necessarily just mean animalistic. Primal means original, means pre-man. Lennon's wild form resembles a roiling cloud of smoke and billowing thunder. He doesn't howl, he roars. And instead of claws, he has lightning. So he still scratches at his enemies, he still rips them apart, but when he does so, when you see him doing it, it is as if lightning is tearing apart his enemies. He believes that it is base to consider himself anywhere close to an animal. He thinks he is something elemental. And it isn't simply that the Get of Lyka are purely storms. They are not just thunder and lightning. I've seen several Get of Lyka who clad themselves in fire, who belch smoke, and others who drip with an acidity that is really quite remarkable. But I think it is fair to say that if I were to attribute any element, so to speak, to the Get of Lyka, thunder and lightning would be it. He's not the only one. They are ultimately an amalgamation of forces. They are not just animals in human skin, or indeed vice versa. Now, you might hear tell that Primal and Hungry don't get along, and that's only a half-truth. There's no war going on between the Primal and the Hungry. There's not even a long-standing dispute from the Get of Lyka toward the heirs. I wager most Get of Lyka couldn't give a tuppenny jizz about what the heirs think. But the heirs, some of them, especially the historians among them, will go up to the Get of Lyka to their face and call them oath-breakers. That's what they call them, because of this story of one of the heirs, maybe even their patriarch, their family head, their progenitor, being killed by the Get of Lyka all those generations ago. They don't do this to get into a fight, you understand. The heirs do this to needle. They do it to humiliate. They do it to show up to the rest of the accursed of the city. These Get of Lyka are just beasts. They are simply feral. And any veneer of humanity that they wear is just that. It's a cloak that they can drop off as easily as they drop off their skin. So watch out for them. Another group to watch out for is the Bisklavray. Now, I should spend some time doing this for each of the primal families, but let's focus slightly on the Get of Lyka, because the primal have a problem, and that is, among all of the lineages, those big five, the vast majority have secured some means of eternal life, or let's call it, slow death. The dead and the outcasts don't worry all that much about aging. The hungry, certainly not. And sorcerers will often make deals to extend their lifespans. Where does that leave the Primal? To just die in their 70s or 80s? Well, the Bisklarvei are elder shapeshifters. They are werewolves of an old style. They are said to transmit disease via their bites, but most importantly, they have extended their lifespans to centuries, and they've realised that the way to do this is by sacrificing their young. I don't know who they did a deal with to get this arrangement, but to extend their lives by a day, a week, a month, killing their own is the way to do it. What a fantastic turning of the tables, where the Get of Lyka are so defined by their protectiveness of their own family that their eldest are prepared to throw the youngest to the wolves, so to speak, to give themselves more years of life. What's worse is the Bisklarvei, because they've been around for so long, there are really few better trappers and trackers. What's more, I understand they set up their own shattered spaces. They know how to form them, and they will trap Lykans within them and slowly pick them apart so that their extended lifespan can be handed out morsel by morsel. You'll get to meet Izzy Plummer one of these days, a nice girl. Very outspoken about the things she likes and the things she doesn't. As far as Lykans go, she's a strong candidate for, well, why others admire them and why others fear them. And why they do both of those things from a distance. That girl is a terror waiting to happen. But so long as she's pointed at a battle-forged zombies, parasites, and other monsters bleeding into our world from the outside, she is exactly what I would have chosen if I were looking for an accursed equivalent of a nuclear weapon. Take off and drop Izzy from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.